All right, thanks everybody for showing up. I'm kind of amazed at the number of people who are here. So we had 6 million acres of fires in Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan this summer. It included one fire in Manitoba that was 600,000 acres that created all the smoke in July and August, and one in northern Ontario, not far from here, was 400,000 acres. And then we had this little thing called the Greenwood Fire in Minnesota, which I was on the radio, on public radio, explaining that it is an absolutely typical fire in the history of the boundary waters. So fires kill trees. That's one of the main things that they do, and I thought it might be fun to look at how they do that. And don't tell me it's because it's hot, I know that. But hot can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different ways, as we will see. So look at this picture, aerial photo of a forest fire. This one was in Colorado, but they don't look much different from that here. And you'll notice there are black areas and there are brown areas and green areas. The black areas had crown fire, so the fire was traveling through the crowns. And when it hit the brown areas, it dropped from the crown to the ground and then continued underneath the canopy, but still, as you see there, it still killed the trees, and that was from hot air rising above the fire. And that is known as scorch, as opposed to char, which means something turns black because it was in contact with the flames. But scorch is incredibly important, and you can have foliage scorch, and you can also have Basil Scorch, where the tree can be girdled at the base. So we'll look at those. And why do the fires jump in and out of the crowns as they travel across the landscape? Well, we'll find that out as well. So heat comes off of a fire in radiant heat. You all know what radiant heat is when you sit around a campfire on a cool night and you can feel the radiant heat. So radiant heat can impinge on the tree. There can be convection of hot air that the fire creates that goes up, and there can be conduction of heat, which is the slowest way for heat to move. The roots could be killed by conduction of heat, and that takes a long time, actually, compared to radiant heat and convection. So mortality of trees from fire. So there's root scorch if the fire goes down in the ground. There's crown consumption during crown fires. There's Basil scorch, in other words, girdling the tree at the base in surface fires, and crown scorch in surface fires. And you see here some redwood trees that were scorched in a fire, and they are responding with thousands of new branches sprouting out of the trunk. Whoever knew redwood trees could be that resilient. I can pretty much guarantee you our trees in Minnesota will not do that. So let's cover those first two. So here is the ground consumption of the rooting layer, and this happens in deep peat or where there's a shallow soil on top of bedrock. And you see one of Bund Heinzelman's classic pictures here of a forest in moss on top of rock, and the flames are only a foot tall, but it's going to kill the whole forest because the roots are in the moss, which is going to be consumed. And that's what it looks like afterwards. So no way did that fire kill the foliage other than by first killing the roots. And here's the same thing in peat. You can see the fire was moving through here, and it actually burned off roots probably over 10 or 12 hours that were 6 inches thick. And it got to a certain place in the peat where there was just too much water, and it couldn't evaporate the water fast enough to ignite the peat, and it just stopped. But it did kill these trees via destroying their root systems. So that's roots. Then there's canopy mortality from crown fire. This is a good picture of that in the Cavity Lake fire near Seagull Lake in the Boundary Waters. This was a balsam fir forest here, and about 40 feet tall. It's completely toasted. The flowers were probably 100 feet high, and the tree's only 40 feet high. So all the foliage was consumed, and in spite of all the dead balsam fir from spruce budworm creating a fire hazard, in an extreme drought, a live balsam fir will burn explosively. They do not have to be dead to burn. And this is proof of that. And then this jack pine here, which is another one of Bud Heinzelman's pictures, was killed by Canoe Scorch from a surface fire with hot air above it. You can tell that because there are still a lot of things clinging to the twigs there that would have been consumed if that had been a crown fire. And the needles, of course, later dropped off because they had died. So probability of go into the canopy to begin with. So a fire is running along the surface and will make a decision is jump into the canopy. Well, if the foliage is dry, if it's a drought and the water content is pretty low and the base height is low, then there's a very high chance it will jump into the canopy. Young jack pine forests that are old, for example, very easy to have a crown fire. And don't let anybody try to convince you that young forests aren't as flammable. They are. They don't support as much intensity to kill a small tree. Low canopy and dry foliage makes it very easy to jump into the crown. A high canopy base height and dry foliage or a low canopy base height and wet foliage are kind of medium examples. And then wet foliage, so it's not a drought, and a high canopy base height means there's a very low chance that the fire will jump from the ground into the canopy. So you can also have ladder fuels. So this spruce tree, if it was close enough to the pine here, it could be a ladder fuel to carry a fire up into the crowns. And that's what balsam fir does in white and red pine. So that's basically why it goes into the canopy or not. And then the question is, if it jumps in the canopy, will it stay? Will it just torch up in one little group of trees, known as a passive crown fire, or will it run across the whole landscape in the crowns? Well, that depends on how fast the fire is moving, so its rate of spread, and the density of the crowns. So if the crowns of the trees are packed in really tight, like a 30 or 40-year-old jack pine stand, high crown bulk density, it doesn't have to be moving very fast to be in this crowning zone. Anything on this side of the red line is crowning. Anything on this side is not crowning. So if it's moving through a forest with a given bulk density and all of a sudden, and it's on the forest floor and all of a sudden it speeds up because the wind speed increases, you can go from non-crowning to crowning. And if the fire is going across the landscape, say in a jack pine stand on a rocky hilltop where the trees are not very dense, and then it comes to a different stand of trees where the density is higher, then it can go from non-crowning to crowning as well. So that's how it stays in the canopy. So as long as there's sufficient conifer foliage in the canopy for the speed at which it's moving, it can stay as a crown fire. And the rate of spread depends on what type of forest it is. So in spruce forests and jack pine forests, here the rate of spread at a given fire weather index, so that depends on how dry the fine fuels are. You know, those Smokey Bear signs where it says the fire danger is low or moderate or high today. So low would be down here, moderate, which I saw on the sign when I was driving to Ely today, is here, and then high. In other words, fuels are dry and it's very windy or something like that. So for a given index of fuel flammability, it will have the slowest rate of spread in red and white pine. So if you have a red and white pine forest that doesn't have that balsam fir understory, if it's coming out of jack pine and it hits a red pine forest, it's likely to slow down enough to drop down to the ground. And that's why red and white pine forests don't have as many crown fires as jack pine forests, because in older stands, the trees are spread widely apart. There's spaces in between the crowns, and so the canopy density is not high enough. Mixed wood is aspen and birch mixed with spruce and fir. We have a lot of that around here. That's kind of intermediate, and then spruce and jack pine are the fastest. So for a given index of fire weather, it would go slowest in red and white pine, medium in mixed wood, and fastest in a high density spruce or jack pine stand. And again, the faster it goes, the more likely it is to stay in the crowns. And so here are some of those fuel types. So I said it goes fastest in jack pine. Here's a 50-year-old jack pine stand from one of Bud Heinzelman's pictures. Does that look like a high canopy density to you in the upper left? That would easily sustain a crown fire. Here's an old white pine forest, and you can see the density up there in the high canopy is not very great. There's not a lot of foliage up there, and it would be really hard for a fire to run through the top of that crown. Here's a dense spruce stand. If you had an exterior view, it would look a lot like the jack pine there. So these are the two types on the left where it will move really fast and therefore tend to stay in the crowns. And these on the right, the red white pine and the mixed wood, where you have aspen and birch mixed with spruce and fir. The conifer density is not very high in that mixed wood, and so it will not move very fast. So when fires hit an aspen birch stand with a little bit of fir and spruce, they tend to drop out of the crowns down to the ground. So as a fire is traveling across the landscape, it will encounter different stands of trees with different characteristics, and that's why it flares up in the crowns and goes back down to the ground. The wind might push it faster in the middle of the day, meaning it has a higher chance of being in the crown compared to at night. And going up a hill, it will go faster as well than if it's on a flat site or going down a hill. So all of those things contribute to that pattern of burned with crown fire and scorched and unburned, like I showed you in the second picture a few minutes ago. So some predictions of actual tree mortality now, if we kind of go down to the individual tree level. Why do they die? How high is the char on the stem? This is from the Pagami Creek fire, and the char goes all the way up to the top. Of all these trees, it was a 300-foot flame length. You could actually see the flames on a satellite image of that fire when it made its big run of about 17 miles in 6 or 7 hours. And you've probably also filmed the Forest Service made about the 6 rangers who were caught. They thought the fire was 10 miles away, and it was actually right where they were. And they ended up, 4 of them ended up landing on a small rock in the middle of the lake, a small island, no bigger than in between the tables here in front, put on their fire blankets, and even out in the middle of the lake, they were surrounded by orange plasma that was 1,000 degrees in temperature. You cannot run away from these fires. So char height, if it's charred all the way to the top, of course, it was a crown fire, the trees are dead. If it's only charred up 5 or 6 feet, there might have been hot air rising up to the canopy to scorch the foliage, or there might not. Bark thickness is important. If it's a surface fire, is it going to kill the cambium right under the bark? Well, that depends on how thick the bark is and how long the fire lasts, as we'll see in a minute. And then the percent of the canopy that ends up being scorched is important for the mortality. And it has to get up to anywhere from 120 to 160 degrees to kill live foliage. So that's not very hot compared to the temperature of a fire, which is usually up around 800 or 900, but can go up to a couple thousand degrees in some cases. So let's talk about basal scorch. Will the fire girdle the tree by killing the cambium around the base of the tree? So this is a slab from an oak tree. It has pretty thick bark, and we have this convenient formula here. T equals 2.9 x squared, which all of my students in my class have to memorize and know how to use. And it's basically T is time in minutes, X is bark thickness in centimeters, and 2.9 is the coefficient. So this is 2 centimeter thick bark, which is a little under an inch. So 2 squared is 4 times 2.9 is 11.5 or something like that. That's how long that tree could be exposed to the radiant heat or the heat of a flame before the cambium, which is right under the bark, would be killed. Bark is an incredibly good insulator, right? Yeah. Time in minutes, yep. And that's at standard temperature of 20 degrees C, which is 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's assuming the flame is 932 Fahrenheit, which is 500 Celsius. Of course, those things vary. On a hot day, it would take a little bit less. On a cold day, it might take a little bit longer. So here's a graph that shows trees by diameter from small trees to big trees here: white spruce, balsam fir, aspen, jack pine, red and white pine. Time for cambial death. So we all know bark is thicker on bigger trees than smaller trees. So if you just measure the thickness of bark on trees from small to large, the large here is about 15 or 16 inches in diameter, which is 40 centimeters. Red and white pine, it's 12 minutes. Aspen, it's 8 minutes. Balsam fir and white spruce have the thinnest bark, and it's only 5 or 6 minutes, even for the big ones. Most of the time you have big white pines with small fir. So you could actually have a differential where it would take 12 minutes of exposure to the flame to kill the white, and more in a 300-year-old white pine, it might be 30 minutes. Whereas a balsam fir tree the size of a Christmas tree would be toast in about a minute. So the fire can go through a forest as a surface fire, and it can differentially kill different trees depending on their size and their species. Tamarack is similar to jack pine. Yeah, it actually gets fairly thick bark when it's older. Yeah, and a lot of the tamarack in Minnesota before European settlement was actually upland tamarack. That was big trees that are as big as white pine, and they were cut down to be telephone poles and railroad ties. And we think of tamarack as being a stunted tree that grows in swamps, but that's because those are the only ones we left. Larch, which is the other name for tamarack, actually makes up most of the boreal forest across Russia. And they had a 40 million acre fire there this summer. 40 million acres, that's 2.5 times as much as all the forest in Minnesota. Okay, so a little bit about fire scars. So sometimes a tree gets a scar, so the heat penetrates in to kill the cambium only on one side of the trunk. Why does that happen? Well, if you look at the behavior of a fire, and here's another one of Bud Heinzelman's classic picture, look at the fire on one side of that red pine tree there. Here's a little fir tree, which is already toast after 30 seconds or whatever, but here's a red pine tree, and it might burn like that on one side of the tree for 20 minutes and get a scar there and be fine because there's enough cambium left on the rest of the circumference of the trunk that the tree can continue to grow. And one of the things that happens as a flame approaches the trunk of a larger tree, it starts to wrap around the tree in advance of the main flame front getting there. And then as it leaves the tree, that standing leeward flame stays there. So you can actually get twice the duration of flame exposure on the lee side of the tree from which the fire came. So if the trees are on a hill, the fire's moving up a hill, the uphill side will have the fire scars, which is a very common case. And as the fire approaches those trees, it wraps around and it forms a vortex there like a little mini tornado, and that can double the duration of the flame exposure on that side of the tree. And you see red pines throughout the boundary waters where that's the case. So the trees have gone to the trouble to get bark just thick enough to resist the average flame duration, but not double the flame duration, because they've been able to survive for hundreds of years after being fire scarred. So why bother to get bark 2 feet thick unless you happen to be a giant sequoia and you're going to live for 3,000 years? It would be a waste of resources for our trees to get bark that thick, because they know they're not going to live 3,000 years, and it's not worth the investment in that much bark. So here's the tree, and there's the leeward side vortex. And if you look straight on it, the heat is really shaped like a Gothic church door. And that's why you get scars that are shaped like that. So that's 100 degrees Celsius, 200 degrees Celsius heat, which is really hot. Yeah, when they tried the metric system in, was it 1973 or something, or 75, I told my grandmother she could bake bread at 180 degrees, and she said, oh, no, you can't, it won't bake. But I said 180 Celsius is like 300 Fahrenheit, and she says, well, it won't work anyway. And of course, we only tried the metric system for, like, what was it, 6 months before people complained, and we went back to the English system. Anyway, my grandmother knew how to cook things, and regardless that she didn't understand the metric system. So here's flow of fires around trees. If fire is moving really fast, it'll go in laminar flow and not form the vortex. For a fire that is being blown by a really high wind and moving really fast, it'll do laminar flow around a small tree. It's only when you have pretty big trees, medium or large, and it's moving at a medium speed, that it will form those vortexes and make a scar. And that obviously is a very common situation, because we have a lot of fire-scarred trees here. And this is one of Bud Heinzelman's classic photos. A red pine from LaCroix, and it has a whole bunch of different fire scars here, and you can count the rings back from the outside of the tree to each fire scar. And of course, once it scars in one place, then the bark there is much thinner on the new tissue, and it will scar there over and over. And here's a white pine with a scar, and you can see here for bark 1.2 inches thick, which would be your 300-year-old red or white pine, 26 minutes before it will kill the cambium. Whereas 0.2 of an inch thick, which is a balsam fir, 44 seconds before it'll kill the cambium. So it shouldn't be surprising that a surface fire causes really differential mortality among trees depending on the size of each tree and the species of each tree. Okay, now let's do crown scorch, which I think is the most fun of all here. So always, I use this lecture in my class, so you're actually taking a part of my class in fire ecology today. It's undergrad and grad mixed together. The grad students get much more complicated problems to calculate, but anyway. So this is total tree height, and if the surface fire went under these trees and the foliage turned brown up this high, then that would be scorched foliage, and that would be live foliage. That would be the scorch height from the ground. And this would be, that height compared to that would be the proportion of the crown that's scorched. Obviously, if it's a conifer that slopes a lot, you want to use a conic formula, or some conifers are almost cylindrical, so the proportion of the height is equal to the proportion of the foliage that was scorched. So that's the concept. Here are some scorched trees. A ponderosa pine, that the flame was probably only about that high, maybe 3-4 feet, and you can see there's brown foliage from the rising hot air that was killed. And the same with this one. Was probably a 5 or 6 foot flame, and it killed some of the foliage way up there on this particular tree. So that's like 50 or 60% foliage scorch. The higher the foliage scorch, the higher the chance of mortality. And so this is the concept of a fire. There's the flames. sweeping through a forest, and the air that high above the flames is hot enough to kill the foliage. So when it went by this tree, it killed the foliage on these two lower branches. It charred or scorched the bark, and when it gets to this tree, it's going to kill the foliage on those lower branches and maybe a little bit there. So there's this invisible line of hot air above the flame that is hot enough to kill foliage. Yeah. Yeah, the question is about the terminal buds. Well, buds are slightly more heat resistant than foliage. So it may or may not kill them because it could scorch the foliage and have been way hotter than it needs to be to scorch them. It's not enough to kill the bud, because it would have to get up to like 160 to 180 degrees to kill the bud. So it may or may not, but we do have cases where the foliage is all scorched and some of the buds on the upper part of the tree survive, especially with white pine. That doesn't happen with balsam fir or spruce as far as I know, but sometimes it happens with white pine. That you can kill all the foliage and the terminal bud will still survive. But that for a young tree, for an old tree, if you toast all the foliage, the tree will die. So old trees just can't deal with 100% foliage loss. So here is a relationship between the intensity of fire. You don't need to know what I to the power 2/3 is. It's kilowatts per meter times 259.83 times L raised to the power 2.174. Don't worry about that. It's a measure of intensity. And here the intensity of the flame is such that you could step on it. It's 6 inches high. In the middle here, you're talking about flames that are probably 4 or 5 feet, and over on this side, you're talking about flames that are 30 or 40 feet, just the actual flame. And what is the scorch height? Well, here's the chart. If the flame length is 1.6 feet, the scorch height is about 4.6 feet. If the flame length is 11.5 feet, the scorch height is 77 feet. And for a 30-foot flame, you're going to scorch 300 feet high. We don't have any trees 300 feet tall in Minnesota at this time. We probably did in the past. I'm talking tens of millions of years ago when we had a tropical climate. But the tallest trees in Minnesota are between 120 and 140 feet, and so a flame of 16 to 18 feet would toast their foliage all the way to the top through scorch, just the rising hot air. And this is what happened on the other Greenwood Lake on Gunflint Trail. They did a test burn there after the 1999 blowdown, and they killed a 300-year-old stand of white pine because the flame length was longer than they thought it was, because they didn't know anything about fire behavior in blowdown slash. Now we know a lot about it, but they didn't know anything about it then. And they thought the flames would be 5 feet, and the flames were actually like 13 feet. And so instead of scorching up 22 feet, which wouldn't even reach the base of a white pine crown, it scorched up like 60 or 70 feet, and it scorched more than half of the crowns, and a lot of those old white pines died. So there's a huge difference here between a 5-foot flame and a 10-foot flame. That's the difference between 23 feet high scorch and 77 feet high scorch. In the rocky country here, like you have around Ely, hardly any trees are more than 77 feet tall. So an 11 or 12-foot flame will kill all the foliage all the way to the top of the tree. So here's an example. This is a 300-year-old red pine. The flame was about that high where that yellow bar is, and there's actually another yellow bar at the top here at the 80-foot level, but the flame that tall killed the foliage all the way to the top of the tree. So the tree died because it had 100% foliage scorch. And here's a white pine stand on Miles Island in Seagull Lake, 300 years old. And this one was scorched. These are scorched about 50%. So 50% of the foliage was scorched by rising hot air. And the question is, what's the mortality rate going to be for that? So it's not completely toasted. Well, here's a relationship that was made for percent crown scorch from 0 to 100 and percent mortality from 0 to 100. So if you have 100% crown scorched, you're going to get 100% chance of mortality like we saw on that big red pine. But for those white pines that are 50% scorched, which is right there, it's only a 10% chance of mortality. So trees generally can withstand losing half of their foliage and still have a very low chance of mortality. So, and that's an issue this year because a lot of them have thinned out their foliage in response to the drought. So, so they have that much redundancy. They can afford to be 50% scorched or lose 50% of their foliage for some reason and still have very low mortality, only around 10%. This is for red and white pine, though. Balsam fir, completely different story, right? I mean, driving along the highway today, I saw lots of balsam firs that have what I call balsam fir fry from the heat wave that in July and August, and they're dead. The ones on the north side of the highway, which are facing south. Much more of those were dead than the ones on the south side of the highway where they're facing north, so they didn't get as much heat from the sun at midday as the ones on the north side of the highway. Microphone and this ear thing and Zoom and PowerPoint going all at the same time. I didn't even know my computer could do all those things at once. So, but now I do know, so. Okay, except now it's not advancing. So I must have been disconnected somehow. Sure. Fill in with questions.
Yeah, the balsam fir, is it just a factor of the thin bark or also that thick? That makes it so flowery?
It's both, and the fact that the foliage tends to be a very high density, so the flame can spread through the crown really fast. Oh, there we go. So these are jack pines that were in the Pagami Creek fire of 2011, which is just to the east of Ely here. And you can see the fire approached from the right side of the picture. There's no foliage on the trees. There's a lake shore here with boulders. Away from the lake, there's no foliage, so it was a crown fire. And as it approached the lake, it dropped from crown to ground, probably because the trees are tapped into the water table, had more water in their foliage. And remember, from earlier on, wetter foliage means bigger chance of not being able to sustain as a crown fire. So it dropped from crown to understory fire with a long flame length and killed that tree, toasted its crown all the way to the top. And as it approached the lake, the flames got shorter and shorter, and so does the scorch height. So these trees here are about half scorch, and these trees here are only 20% scorch that are right next to the water. These little white cedar trees were scorched by radiant heat coming from the flame. They had contact with flame because the foliage is not black. So it had to be radiant heat, and no way the fire went under them when they're growing on rock, so it had to be radiant heat coming from the side. So yeah, this type of forensic ecology is really fun. If you ever get a chance to hike around with me in a forest after it burned, and I can tell you which tree died from Basil Scorch, which one died from foliage scorch, which one had the foliage consumed by the fire. Very interesting. This is a white and red pine forest in the Pagami Creek fire. And the flames, as you can see by the height of the char, were maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 feet high. And look at the ground. It is absolutely covered with pine needles. So what happened? My graduate student came into my office and said, there's more duff on the forest floor after the fire than before. And I said, well, that can't be. We know that fires consume the duff on the forest floor. And I thought he was crazy. And then we figured out that this understory fire with flames maybe 5 to 8 feet tall toasted the entire canopy with rising hot air. The needles died and they all fell off a few weeks later and made a duff layer on the forest floor, even though the fire had consumed the existing duff. So anything can happen in nature. And here's, this is Ham Lake fire at the end of the gun plant. You can see there's a tree that was killed by crown scorch. There's another one killed by crown scorch. There's a little group killed by crown scorch. There's a whole bunch of live trees. This was a spring fire. It was in May, right after ice out. It's the one that I was trapped in for 3 days, which I should tell you about that sometime in one of these. But you can read Gunflint Burning, because Kerry does a better job of telling my story than I do, because he's a good writer. But anyway, spring fires tend to be very uneven in their intensity, because they're encountering water in the forest floor, and the trees water at that time of year, and so you have dead trees and scorched trees and live trees all jumbled together right next to each other. And little trees like these white pines here at the end of the Gunflint Trail, of course, these are white pines. It only takes like less than a minute to scorch them. Their bark is like the thickness of 2 sheets of paper. And even though it was out in an open field and the flames went down to only, because they had been planted in an open field after salvaging the wind throw of 1999. So the flames were only 6 inches high, but that's all you need to kill a white pine tree that's 3 or 4 feet high, because the bark is as thick as a sheet of paper. The foliage is still on them, so you know it wasn't a mini crown fire 3 feet high. It girdled them at the base. And then this little tree here in the foreground was lucky because this rock split the fire and the fire went around it. So very lucky little tree right there. That's the end. Yeah, this is one of the 300-year-old pine stands that burned in the Cavity Lake fire of 2006 at Seagull Lake. And look at that little group of balsam fir trees that survived, and that's because there's a seepage coming out right there. And they had soaking wet foliage, even though the rest of the forest was dry because the fire was in a severe drought during a heat wave in July. But no drought for that little group of balsam fir, so they're the lucky ones. Here's another little group. So that's all I had prepared to say, and so I imagine there might be a question or two. Yeah. How long will the dead trees stay standing? Our experience is that at least half of them fall during the 2 years, but there are some dead trees killed by fire that will stand for 30 or 40 or even 50 years, and those become woodpecker habitat and all sorts of other habitat for all sorts of other species. So the first 2 years is when there's just trees falling everywhere. And I remember doing field work after the Cavity Lake fire in 2006 and trying to climb up a steep hill like you see in the picture here, grabbing a tree like the size of that one. And you're going up the hill, you grab this uproots into your hand, even though it's a 6-inch diameter tree. And then what? Well, you let go of the tree and you jump the opposite direction. Otherwise, you and the tree will both go down the hill. But this picture is taken like 3 years later, and a lot of these trees will remain standing for decades now, because these are the ones with stable anchorage where the roots didn't burn out, the main roots. The branches will fall off, and then you'll have snags. And so in the boundary waters, it's natural to have many tons of standing dead snags per acre as a result of the history of forest fires. That's the natural state of the forest. It should be that way. Yeah. Would they be good for lumber? Some of them would. Some of these big pines would, but the cost of getting it out of there would be more than the value of the lumber. Yeah. After the 1999 blowdown, people suggested that a lot of the timber in the boundary water should be salvaged, and Minnesota Forest Industries said no way, because it costs $700 an hour to fly a helicopter into a roadless area to lift groups of logs out, and the logs are only worth, you know, less than the helicopter time. So, yeah, it's not an option in remote wilderness areas. And then if you do salvage them, you have to be really careful. If you get the least little bit, if you're going to make it into paper and you get the least little bit of charcoal in there, it can ruin $1 million worth of paper. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, despite the quality of the writing in Gunsplit Burning, it sounded like you and your friends were on an island, and you saw the fire coming, and it burned past this island on the shoreline across from you. Could you describe that?
Oh, well, yeah, we were actually shoving off from 3 Mile Island, which is the big island that essentially divides Seagull Lake into two. It actually is 3 miles in length. That's why it's called that. There's no nuclear reactor there. And we had just visited the ancient cedars, and we shoved off, and then we saw the plume of smoke in the sky. And so we landed on Eagle's Nest Island, which has a high cliff. And we decided to climb up to that top of that cliff and see what the fire was doing, and it was roaring straight towards us. And by then, a 40-mile-an-hour wind had come up. And so we decided that island was close to the south side. We decided we had to get to the north side of the lake immediately. So we went back down and got in the canoe and made a crossing of Seagull Lake with a 34-degree water temperature and 3 to 4 foot waves, which I hope to never do again. And while we were doing it, Gus Axelson, who was in the stern of the canoe, said, "I have a 2-year-old kid at home." So I don't know whether that got in the book or not, but that's what he told me. He said, "I want to see my 2-year-old kid again." And so we made a crash landing. We made a crash landing. I mean, we were only clearing the waves by a half an inch in the bow where I was, and crash landed on the north side. And then we were stuck there for 3 days before the fire changed direction and we got out, and it calmed down. I mean, we didn't want to go out in those big waves, which persisted for 2.5 more days. And we went down the Seagull River to Voyager's Canoe Outfitters, which is where we had launched. And while we were going down the river, the east side was on fire. And while we were getting out of canoe, a chunk of a burning balsam fir tree flew over our heads and landed on the other side of the river. And then that ignited, and we could hear it torch up and burn trails and campground. So that's while we were getting out of the canoe. Yeah, there's lots of details that probably didn't get in the book, but yeah, and the whole time we were trapped at that campsite at the Palisades on Seagull, which is the best campsite you could be trapped at, because it has that big cliff that you can climb and look and see what the fire is doing. And so the whole time it was like a snowstorm of gray, fluffy ash raining down on us. And we had just run out of food at the time that the lake calmed down and we could get out, which was good. Yeah, and the other thing is Wilderness Canoe Base is there, and they're associated with the Lutheran Church, and they have a chapel. So they lost 47 buildings, but the chapel did not have the sprinkler system and it didn't burn. And so we came around the corner and you couldn't even see this chapel before because of all the spruce and fir trees. And here's the chapel sticking out like, you know, just like it had been built on a barren rock. And we didn't know what to make of it. And the director of the camp told us it was divine intervention, that it didn't burn. But when I went to look at it, there was like 15 feet of gravel around it. So I think that's what saved it. It's following the laws of physics, which I guess God created to begin with anyway. So anyway, yeah, that was quite the experience. And then there was a hot shot crew where we got out of the canoe and they came and said, "Are you Lee?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "We've been wondering what happened to you for the last 3 days." And I said, "Well, I teach a class in forest fires. You didn't need to worry about us at all." And so they guided us back to our cars, which were sitting there in perfect shape in a black moonscape because the owner of the outfitter had put a sprinkler on our cars before evacuating. So here's this it's just black moonscape everywhere, and our cars are sitting there, you know, with the bright colors and everything. And we drove down the Gunflint, escorted by the hotshot crew, and all the telephone poles are on fire. So you had to look at each one and judge whether it was going to fall. And finally, we got to Gunflint Lodge, and Gus and Lane continued down to Grand Marais and listened to me on the radio while they were eating lunch in the Angry Trout Cafe, because I got shoved in front of all the TV cameras to tell people what the fire was like. So that was that story. Yeah, well, yours and then yours. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, this is a question from online there.
Okay.
I had the opportunity to drive on Highway 2 after the Greenwood fire. It just stuck out to me is that an area that had recently been selectively harvested, red pine, appeared to have been affected even more than areas where nothing was done. Are harvesting methods leading to increased fire hazard, or were these trees with high winds driving across fire?
Well, I wasn't at that spot at that time, but if you do a selective harvest and you leave the branches behind on the forest floor, that will create fuel for a much more intense fire when the fire reaches that area. So if that's what happened, that the branches of the trees were left and they took the trunks only, you easily create a more intense fire that way. And there are a lot of documented cases in the scientific literature of high fire intensities going through recently logged areas. However, if you removed the understory and the branches along with it, then you would have lowered the density of the canopy, and there wouldn't be a lot of fuel on the forest floor to support the flames, and it would become less intense. So you can infer that probably they left the branches there and the fire became more intense from if that situation is as described. Yep, and you have a question.
On the Greenwood fire, given climate change and places that are some places that are essentially new, what do you think are some good options? Since it's not in the wilderness, so you can manage the forest. What do you think are some good options for replanting? Do we want to do some migration of things like sugar maple or oak, or do we want to just let it come back naturally, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's not a sugar maple type of place there. It's not the right type of site. Our experience, and we're going to publish a paper about this soon, is that red maple, not sugar maple, but red maple is increasing after fires in the boundary waters. So we have good data on that. Red maple in all the textbooks says red maple is wiped out by fire, while these red maple trees in northern Minnesota didn't read the textbook. So we're seeing an increase in maple and oak by itself. So the forest is adjusting itself for the warmer climate. So I would examine in the next couple summers, I would examine the forest floor and see what type of seedlings are germinating. And if you're getting things they like, leave it alone. If it's all aspen and you don't want it to be all aspen, then add some conifer seeds or some conifer seedlings, you know, which would be white pine or red pine or jack pine in that area, as long as you're in a well-drained area, or it could be black spruce in a lower area. So I'd wait a little bit and see what it needs to do and see if that looks good, rather than jumping in immediately with something. Because if you go in there and do some sort of operation when they're only an inch high, you can destroy them all because the ecosystem is incredibly vulnerable in those first couple years after a fire. But seeding is usually okay. If you can get seeds, if you know that it was all aspen and you don't want it to be all aspen, or it was aspen and fir and you'd rather have pine, go in, and if you can get some seed, you could go in and seed it without doing any damage. The microstructure, in other words, the logs, the fallen logs, the burned out stumps, that microtopography, as we call it, is incredibly important for survival of the seedlings. So whatever you do, do not level that out. The shade of a log on a hot day can make the difference between whether a seedling dies or not, because it's only an inch or two tall, and the shade from a log is a big thing for that seedling. And rotting wood will become habitat for many, many species later on as the new forest develops. Yeah.
We're talking a lot about trees. If you have a crown fire or some version of fires you talked about, can there be a big difference in terms of what happens to the ground and the woody vegetation, whether it's, I think virgin aspen is having wood systems that can rebound, or even other woody shrubs or
Yeah.
herbaceous.
Yeah, the question is about other vegetation other than the pines. Well, this picture right here, all this light green you see is all paper birch. And that's all from seed. Paper birch will sprout from the stump, not from the roots. Aspen will sprout from the roots. And what we found is spring and early summer fires, you get much more aspen, whereas late summer to fall fires, you get more paper birch. And in this particular case, it was blown down in 1999 and then burned a few years later. The conifers, after the blowdown, were either not old enough to bear seeds, or if they were balsam fir that survived the windstorm, they were torched in the fire. So the conifers were almost exterminated here, and this was a late summer fire, so it turned out to be all paper birch. In terms of the understory, or the herbaceous plants, they're different. There's a different suite of plants that survives different types of fires. So a severe fire like this that burned down to the bedrock, but there are still little pockets of soil, you will get things like raspberries, and the seeds could be there from 200 years ago, and they will still germinate. Bicknell's geranium usually has a flush for the first. After a fire, it makes seeds, and then succession moves on, but it just leaves millions of seeds behind. They get covered in the duff of the new forest. They will not germinate until they see sunlight, which means there was another disturbance. So in this area, we had pretty much solid coverage of Bicknell's geranium 2 years after the fire, and the last fire was 1801, so all those seeds are 200 years old. And then there are little patches of forest floor that don't burn. You can walk through a really heavily burned site like this, and there'll be a little patch, maybe 3 feet in diameter, of the original forest floor that for some reason just didn't burn, and that has all the seeds of the herbs that you would find in the understory, even from an old growth forest, and that's where the recovery comes from. So if you have 10 of those on an acre, none of the seeds need to go more than 10 or 20 feet in order to restore all the old growth species as the forest redevelops. It's absolutely amazing. Yep, it's true of fungal spores, it's true of mosses. You do get a good succession in mosses right after the fire. You get a moss that's called the juniper haircap, and another type of moss which is called dicranum, and I'm not sure if it has a common name, but these are mosses that like hot, dry places. And then as the shade develops, your feather mosses come back in, you know, because we have like 400 moss species on the Superior National Forest, and probably 400 or 500 fungi and at least that many lichen species. And they're all around on the landscape, and they will all come back by various means. Yeah.
What about earthworms?
Yeah, earthworms, how do they react to fire? Well, if the soil's deep enough, they just go down a foot or two and they survive just fine. Their immediate problem is not having any food to eat right after the fire. Some of them can hibernate for a year until there's some new vegetation because they eat leaves, you know. It probably would be a disruption in their numbers, but it would not exterminate them. In fact, we know it wouldn't because experiments have been done. Let's go way in the back there. People have been waiting for a long time back there. Would I recommend cutting balsam around cabins? Yes, because, yeah, they are incredible because of the density of their foliage and their pitch, and they get very dry during droughts. And so, yeah, I would, except my cabin. But my cabin is different because mine is on the shore of Lake Michigan in the fog belt, and they have not had a fire there in thousands of years. But that is not the case here. So yeah, I mean, one of the fire-wise principles for northern Minnesota is don't have any balsam fir very close to your cabin. You know, you can have some that are some distance away. You still want them for wildlife habitat and so on. You don't have to exterminate them. You just don't want them right next to your cabin where they can torch up and put heat onto your cabin that will heat the side of it up to like 800 degrees so that it bursts into flame, which is something that can happen when a clump of balsam torches up. Yeah.
I noticed several very small oak trees on site.
Mm-hmm.
But there are no mature oaks. Where do the acorns come from?
Yeah, where do the acorns come from? Well, we have this bird called the blue jay, and blue jays really love acorns. And in fact, each blue jay moves thousands of acorns around the landscape up to a couple of miles. So they carry them in their beak, and they cache thousands of them in certain places to store up food for the winter. And of course, some of them dropped or not used. And so if you have to look for an oak tree for 2 miles in any direction, and if you have seedlings popping up, there probably is one. It might not be within the distance that you can see it right there, but around on the landscape here. Yeah, bur oak, pin oak, and northern red oak, all three, we're finding increased frequencies of climate worms. Yeah, at the base of the Echo Trail, a brand new oak forest on top of there. That's about 20 years old. Dense young northern red oak forest, and which I would guess that 50 years ago would not have been able to grow in the climate that we had at that time. But a climatic limitation for oaks is easing because of a warmer climate. Yeah. Yeah, the question is about soil that's sterilized. So a small portion of the landscape does have the soil sterilized. In most places, not that much heat goes down into the soil because the fire doesn't last long enough. And soil is a very good insulator. But there are a few places where maybe there were 3 or 4 trees that blew down and there was like a pile of wood. And the fire holds there for 12 hours or even 24 hours or even a week. And you can get sterilization of the soil in a small area. If it's a small enough area, stuff will come back. The bacteria and everything will come back when the mice and stuff are running around. They will redistribute all those things. For a bigger area, it might be more serious. For example, the Peshtigo fire, which is on the west shore of Green Bay in 1871, which burned incredibly hot over a couple million acres. And even today, you can see that the forest is stunted, that it doesn't have the moss species and the fungal species and the wildflower species that it should, even after 150 years has gone by. But that was an unusual intensity forest because European settlers had cut down the whole forest and piled slash over the entire landscape. And then that burned in a severe drought, same day as the Chicago fire, by the way, and exterminated large areas, and the recovery is taking literally centuries. But small areas of sterilized soil which are scattered throughout a burn is normal, and that recovers pretty quickly. It's all a matter of the distances for all of those microorganisms that you need for soil function to get back in. Yeah.
I know it's not your area, but in a minute, can you tell us what's going on with sequoias out in California?
What's going on with sequoias and the fires? Yeah, they do have bark 2 feet thick, and it would literally take hours and hours of exposure to flame to kill the cambium under the tree. The big concern there is that if there were fir trees underneath that might be 150 feet tall, I mean, things are on a different scale there. The big trees are 250 feet tall or even 300. And the fir trees are 150, are as tall as our white pines here. They could carry the fire up into the crowns. But in a lot of those sequoia stands, they've been doing prescribed burns for years, and they've gradually killed off that fir understory and thinned out the duff. Yeah, they did put a fire blanket on the world's biggest tree there, the General Sherman tree. I'm not sure it was really necessary, but in order to look good for the media, I mean, I wouldn't have thought it to be necessary, but I can see doing it in order to create a news story to make it look like you're doing something if you're the manager of that park.
They have lost some sequoias, I think.
Yeah, some of the smaller ones. I mean, all sequoia, the ones that are that big were a seedling an inch tall at one point in their life. And yeah, younger ones will definitely be killed because they will have thin bark. But that's a natural thing that's been going on for thousands of years. It is a fire-dependent species. But it depends on its high-frequency, low-intensity fires, surface fires in the understory. And given that most of those had flames 3 to 5 feet high, the chance of hot air going high enough to kill that canopy in the absence of ladder fuels of white fir is pretty much zero under the natural fire regime, which they've been restoring, at least in the really big groves that are famous that have a lot of visitors. Yeah. Well, you don't have to remove the branches; they'll fall off. I mean, if it's next to your house, you might, and you're worried it might fall on people or your car. That's the problem. But branches will fall off by themselves, and you'll end up with the big snake, branchless standing snakes, and those continue to be used for decades or even centuries by wildlife species. So as long as they're not within striking distance of something that they might damage, you can leave them and the branches will naturally fall off. Are we running out of time?
We have run out of time.
Okay, we're out of time. Thanks, everybody.